Folks, we're gathered here today to reflect upon a year of lawmaking that has been the lowest of the low when it comes to standards. You know, to be born into New Zealand is to win the lottery of life, not least of all because we have a robust process for making legislation in a way that gives us quality laws that people respect. What the government did in April was described by the Law Society thus: rushed legislation is bad legislation. And the ACT Party said at the time that rushed legislation with respect to firearm laws would lead to a waning of confidence in the law, a loss of respect for the police, and ultimately create a larger grey market of guns, making New Zealanders less safe than we were on March 14. It's difficult to imagine how not only the government, but all of Parliament could have screwed up worse than the knee-jerk legislation that they forced through in April. The ACT Party takes no comfort from being vindicated by the failure of the gun buyback. And there's lots of figures floating around, but even the conservative ones tell you that we have got fewer than 20% of prohibited firearms handed in. And the Minister of Police says, well, I believe they were handed in because I have faith in the law-abiding firearm community. But the truth is that we had a law-abiding firearm community who, in my view, have become engaged in civil disobedience on a massive scale because Parliament eroded the respect for the law when it disrespected its own lawmaking processes. And so I am mournfully proud to be here today on the last day of the so-called gun buyback, introducing two members and leaders of the Coalition of Licensed Firearm Owners to give their research, their reflections and their presentation on how this year's lawmaking, and particularly the gun buyback, has played out. I should note that members of every political party in Parliament were invited to be here today, and I want to thank the journalists because they're the only ones who showed up. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the President of the Coalition of Licensed Firearm Owners, Michael Dowling. Welcome to the stage. He will then introduce Nicole McKee, and I think Nicole has been an absolute star in calmly and articulately explaining the situation in relation to this year's firearm laws in a way that has been reassuring, but also frank and honest. So we're very pleased to have Nicole here today. Michael, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Dave. Morena koutou. So thank you very much for the press turning up. Appreciate your time, and thank you for David enabling us to do our presentation here. Really appreciate that. So the Council of Licensed Firearm Owners, it's an organisation that brings together a number of sub-organisations. There are around 250,000 licensed firearm owners in New Zealand. It's estimated that around 200,000 of them do not belong to an organisation at all. This organisation represents the views of individuals and associations that hunt, target shoot, collect firearms, are involved in the industry, professional guides, and we're confident that we have the predominant view of firearm owners within this country. Our board includes 6 of the major member organisations: Pistol New Zealand, New Zealand Deerstalkers Association, the National Rifle Association of New Zealand, New Zealand Antique and Historical Arms Association, New Zealand Service Rifle Association, and Sporting Shooters Association of New Zealand. Other members include the International Military Arms Society, Target Shooting New Zealand, New Zealand Shooting Federation, Airsoft New Zealand, New Zealand Black Powder Shooters Federation, and New Zealand Clay Target Association. COLFO has amongst its membership renowned and public authors on the subject of firearms legislation, and we have access to technical experts in a range of areas. We're United Nations accredited, and we've represented New Zealand in the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty and the Programme of Action. We're a member of the World Forum of Shooting Activities. We are predominantly funded by New Zealand individual membership and their associations. So you all know Nicole. We've had a chance to hear from Nicole quite a bit through this year, sadly, because of events that have happened. Nicole's got a presentation she'd like to make. If we could hold the questions to the end, and we're happy to remain here and answer your questions. Nicole.
Morena koutou. Today we enter the last day of a rushed process, the last day of a failed process. The national collection of prohibited firearms from those who legally purchased them with the licences they earned after intensive vetting ends today. The national collection of prohibited firearms from people who own them for their sport, for their job, for their collection and investments, not to kill other people, ends today. And tomorrow we start living a new normal in a society that will have been fed the largest influx of firearms into the grey and the black markets directly because of this government's failed processes. From tomorrow, there will be a number of good people who will be made criminals by this government's arrogance, and this is the new normal. The Council, along with importers, distributors, gathered data from New Zealand Customs as well and came up with an estimated figure of over 170,000 prohibited firearms as at April 2019. They weren't on the streets. The firearms have been stored in police-inspected and approved secure environments. The government will boast that over 50,000 of those firearms have been taken in off the streets and that this is a success. It's a failure of massive proportion because as of tomorrow, there will be over 100,000 prohibited firearms out there that we can no longer guarantee will be securely stored. And this failure should never have occurred. In March, we saw a horrific event, and as a country, we mourned together for the loss of innocence, of lives, and of peace as we knew it. But what happened in April did not unite us. What happened in April just drove a wedge between a sector of our society, and this is not how Kiwis behave. When there's a tragedy, we usually get together and support each other, not try to cause a divide. What we saw was rushed legislation, and that gave us rushed policy with rushed implementation, rushed regulations that caused mountains of errors. Legal firearm owners became new outlaws, justifying their legitimacy, while the real outlaws continued with their crimes. There was no consultation with the firearms community, and COLFO has been around for 26 years, working successfully with government and with police. We have created together world-renowned legislation that has lasted for over 4 decades. Our success has been proven. We are number 2 in the Global Peace Index. This cannot be denied, and it should not have been excluded in the move forward. The errors we see now are the result. We gave repeated advice to restrict the ownership of large capacity magazines, and we have been continually ignored. The reality being that law-abiding licensed owners have been blamed for the tragic loss of life that occurred on March the 15th. We'd like to thank you, the media, for helping us to get the other view, our view, across and out to Kiwis so that they can see the unreasonable manner and the mistreatment of some families that all of us are likely to be living next door to. So what has been affected by this legislation? Bolt-action rifles, lever-action rifles, pump-action rifles, rifles for deer hunting, rifles for pig hunting, rifles for duck shooting. They have all been caught up in the ban of April 2019. It has not just been about semi-automatic firearms. We have seen a list of prohibited firearms constantly changing. The first list came out in July, an updated version in August, another new version in September, and in October, at the end of October, we got a fourth version. We've also had police sending out an update to prohibit ammunition without compensation, and as recently as this month, they also prohibited further parts. There's been no notification to any of the firearm owners that these changes have been constant. And as a result, over 100,000 prohibited firearms will not be handed in today. When we asked the people that we've been talking with, the leaders within COLFO, why there are 100,000 firearms that won't be handed in today, we've come up with 3 reasons. We just bring it down to 3 simple reasons, and not in any particular order. The first one is people are going to hide them. We don't encourage people to hide them because they would be intentionally breaking the law. They will have to remove those firearms from their secure storage facility in order to hide them, and they'll be stepping outside of their fit and proper status. And once they calm down, they then have illegal firearms in their possession, which may go towards the grey and the black markets. Why would they hide them? They're angry. They're angry at the mistreatment that they have received, at the blame that they have received for an event that they did not do. The compensation has not been fair. It's not been reasonable, and it's not available for all of the firearms, the parts, all the ammunition that they own. These are items that have been legally purchased with permission of New Zealand Police. They're deciding to jack up, and a lot of them do not understand the severity of the consequences that they face if they get caught. Another reason is that we have people that we think will be protecting history. There are a number of firearms that have been destroyed over the last few months that have historical significance, and a lot of them are not semi-automatics. Many of them are lever action and bolt action firearms, which you can't even get ammunition for anymore. These are firearms that have been sought by collectors from all over the world, but we cannot send them out to others to take care of them because there is a ban on exportation. Some of these firearms have been looked after for decades. They were hidden before, at the time when the wars were finished, and they may be hidden again in the hope that a new government will see them right and make sure that they can be brought out and retained. These are not items that would be used in any mass shootings. These are items, many of them, that can't be used at all. You may ask, well, what about a collector's licence? Why don't people just apply for those? Well, to get a collector's licence, you have to have already an established collection. And there's many people who hold these firearms that were not restricted before April 2019 and do not have collector's items or collector's licences. They will be denied a collector's licence, so they will hide them. There are so many owners that do not trust the process, the system, or the police to keep their heirlooms safeguarded from destruction. And the third reason is that people just don't know their obligations. They're not hiding under a rock, they just don't know them. The leaders of the council have received an influx of emails, phone calls, text messages, face-to-face communications as recently as last night by people wanting to know if their particular firearms are banned. The advertising campaigns by the government and the police have not addressed what type of firearms are actually being banned. All they've done is criticise and tell people you're going to put you in jail if you don't comply. There are some computer-savvy firearm owners out there who've kept themselves up to date and they've helped to educate others, but there are so many out there that just don't know and they don't have those tools. There have been so many regular amendments by police that it's really hard to keep up with. And if you try and call the police 0800 number, you're lucky if you get through. And if you do get through, there's quite often inconsistent advice that's been given out over the telephone. Tomorrow, in this new normal, we will wake up to a new set of criminals made of law-abiding people. Could this have been handled in a different manner? Yes, it could have. And the warning signs have been there for months. What have we seen from police? They've updated and changed their list 4 times. They prohibited ammunition. They did another list prohibiting magazines. There's been a data breach, and that system is still down. It's not working. If registration is introduced in the future, we fear that the security lapses will drive non-compliance. There's an introduction of a new facial recognition technology database for CCTV. Firearm licence owners are being lumped in with convicts and sex offenders. We're asking, why is our images being put in with these people when the biggest image database would be held in the driver licensing system? Police are still not able to give us guidance on parts that are not specifically listed in the regulations. And police can claim that their policy will trump the law when it's required. There's absolutely no confidence in police to administer the Act, and later on today we'll be releasing stats on our trust and confidence survey. There's errors already in the current registration system. There are security and trust issues of the data and the providers of that system. The community is being targeted and demonised by police hierarchy. And what failings have we seen from this government? Well, in 26 years that COLFO's been around, they decided to not communicate with us, to not engage with us. In fact, they thought it was better to just call us names instead. The government did not introduce a public education or information campaign, and they've gone about with an interim militarisation of our police force. They have stuck to their political deadline of the 20th of December for all of these firearms to be handed in, when Australia told them that you needed a 12-month process to get good compliance. And they rushed through the legislation so fast that they had to create a supplementary order paper to try and make their mistakes go away, only they've created more mistakes as a result, when in actual fact they had a moratorium in place that would have lasted through to June 2020, and we could have all done this together right in the first place. Police now have the power to ban other firearms at whim, thank you to this government. And more importantly, there's the Royal Commission inquiry. We haven't had the results of what actually failed New Zealand from there. COLFO has been a balanced voice throughout all of this. We've had our finger on the pulse of multiple changes. We have reached out to police and to government with our expertise. We have encouraged compliance all the way through this. We've given guidances on how people should speak to MPs and present to their select committees. We've sought clarity on the ammunition amnesty extension, and we asked the government to correct their misinformation so that permanent residents knew that they were not being punished for being firearm owners. We had the police correct their wording errors in ammo legislation, and we exposed the police data breach, which was not a hack, but an offering of information to those who could access it. The compensation offered has not been fair nor reasonable. There's been no compensation for banned ammunition, consumables, and many of the affected parts, less than market value of their own price list. Government has kept the costs down because they are not paying for everything. They are confiscating legally purchased items. COLFO believes that this can be handled differently and with a better outcome. If the government look to extend the compensation and amnesty period till June 2020, there will be a 12-month process. Take the Australians' advice, offer fair and reasonable compensation for all affected firearms, their parts, their accessories, the consumables. Offer compensation for the newly banned ammunition. Purchase the items from owners who legally purchased them in the first place. Install that education and information campaign to notify firearm owners about what items are now prohibited, and move away from the rhetoric about this just being about semi-automatics. Await the Royal Commission inquiry and learn from it. And the government should do what it said, pay whatever it takes. Start uniting this country that has been so badly torn apart by the actions of, not by the actions of a sector of our society, but by the actions of a foreign terrorist. The new normal that we will face tomorrow is flawed, and it encourages our society to divide. That should not be the legacy of any government for its people. Thank you. We're open for questions.
Thank you, Nicole.
How much responsibility do you guys take for these 100,000 guns still being out there, given the fact that in the past you have issued press releases telling people not to take part in the buyback?
We offered a press release of concern about people's securities at the at the collection events. And what we did do was we asked the police and the government to look at other alternatives for people to hand in because there was so much mistrust. Those alternatives were made open, and we take responsibility for allowing club-run events to be able to be implemented with the go-ahead of New Zealand Police. That has managed to bring in more firearms.
But you were actively lobbying for people not to take part in these events. Now you're coming out and saying that there are 100,000 guns out there. Surely you must look at this and say, hang on, we're responsible for this in some way.
Sorry, we didn't actively tell people not to engage in a buyback. We told them if they weren't happy with attending a public event, that there were alternatives, and we supported the introduction of alternatives.
So you didn't slow this down at all?
Absolutely not. We actually reminded the police and the government that they said that there would be 4 options available for collection of firearms, and they only made one of those options available. So we encouraged the police and the government to go about setting up those other options. So the people who were not handing in at those public and open events because they were feeling mistrust and lack of confidence would have other avenues. We think that we have actually increased the ability for people to be able to hand in their firearms, not slowed it down.
And it's certainly been supported by discussion with police about the success of the club-based buyback events.
What is your view of gun owners who don't hand over?
They're breaking the law.
They're breaking the law, and we are not encouraging anybody to break the law. Firearms licence owners are law-abiding people. We have gone through the strictest vetting. We've had ourselves, our families, interviewed and assessed. We've had home visits. There is no reason to break the law unless you do not realise what the law is telling you to do. And a lot of people are in that situation.
So you talk about, you think it could be 100,000 guns. How many gun owners do you think it would be?
No.
No idea.
How did you get to that 100,000 estimate? What was the methodology behind that?
So we went out to initially 170,000 is what we've come up with. And that is by going out to distributors and importers throughout the country. So there's 15 main distributors and importers. We got results back from 11 of them. We also got data from customs as to how many firearms had been imported over a 5-year period. We estimated from those stats that have come in directly from the people who have imported and distributed firearms around New Zealand, the 170,000 figure. If the government say that over 50,000 have been brought in through this collection event, then that still leaves over 100,000 to come in.
Well, how do you know that some of those 170,000 people haven't already given their guns in?
Sorry, that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. We were told earlier this week that police believe the figure for the hand-in at the moment was around 52,000. They'll be updating that figure tomorrow. We're erring on the side of caution and saying, so perhaps by tomorrow it's up to 70,000 firearms have been handed in. So we're going to shortfall is 100,000.
Thanks, David.
Do you personally know people who are hiding or refusing to hand in guns?
We've had conversations with some people who have told us of their anger and the way that they're feeling towards the way that they've been treated. Some have indicated that they do not plan on handing in their firearms. And of course, the advice we give is to obey the law. But those stories that we hear have been directly and indirectly from other leaders within our community.
So I had a conversation with a collector earlier this week who was an elderly person who was wrestling with it. He had a firearm that he had bought over 30 years ago that dates back to the end of World War II. That firearm had never been fired, so it was in brand new condition as far as a collector is concerned. So we had a chat about it. I talked about the possibility he could take it into a police station and ask that it be kept for a collection. He tried to contact the police station, couldn't get an answer. In the end, I had a support person take him to a collection event. He handed the firearm over and talked about the history of it and that it was significant. I then made inquiries a day later. It had been bent.
So your advice to people who have that anger and who come to you with that message that they're not handing in, you're saying that you have to do it, you have to obey the law.
Yes, we are. Look, what was seen in Australia is that there were a number of people who were angry and they hid their firearms. And after 6 months and right up to 3 years, after they calmed down, they realised that they couldn't do anything with their firearms. And the amnesty ran in such a way that they were able to take them back in and hand them in. What this government and our police are saying is that if you are in possession of those firearms, we're going to put you in jail for 5 years. No excuses.
Didn't they make a large portion of these firearm owners unlawful firearm owners?
Correct. The biggest influx of criminals from law-abiding people.
Doesn't it pose a big problem for you and your membership?
It causes a big problem for all of New Zealand and New Zealand society. This does not make New Zealand a safer place.
So you'll be kind of representing unlawful firearm owners.
Why would we be representing unlawful firearm owners? As we mentioned at the start, around 200,000 people don't belong to clubs. So the people that belong to clubs are amongst the most compliant because they have endorsements, they have additional requirements on them. Our experience is those that have the higher level of vetting are more likely to be compliant.
Of those firearm owners who say they don't have intention to hand in their guns, have you passed on that information to police?
We haven't had anyone directly that said, I'm not handing it in at all to date to us. When we've had people have a conversation, as I gave the example, we've said, what are the avenues and have we got a support person that can help you through this? Additional ones I had about a month ago, similar experience, didn't know what to do, suggested they take it into the police station. I had confirmation from the arms officer, it was handed in. That's how we're approaching it. The intent of COLFO, when it was set up originally, was to deconflict positions between different associations and ensure that those that wanted to remain compliant could do so easily. So our advice is always to be compliant with the law.
Have you both had to hand in guns? What was the compensation like for that?
I have an application in for an endorsement. It's been in for, must be 13 weeks now.
So come tomorrow, if you still have that gun, is that unlawful?
Police have said that they're going to extend the amnesty and the buyback compensation for those that have an application, and I'm not sure where that sits in the law, but I'm not a lawyer.
Is there any sort of excuse? You mentioned here that there are some owners who are ignorant of the fact that they are being guns. I mean, that's in April. How, yes, it's changed throughout that time, but how is it any excuse not to know?
So an experience I had this week was with a lawyer, a very informed person who doesn't work in this area, and they'd gone through and thought, I wonder if this firearm is affected, and then took the opportunity to take the bullets and put it inside the magazine and realised that its capacity was more than 10.
Isn't that system working? Isn't it up to the people with the guns to figure out if they're breaking the law or not?
Absolutely, and we think they need more time to do that.
Yes, when we have the government with their rhetoric about this being about semi-automatics, when we talked about the lever actions, pump actions and bolt actions that have been affected, there are quite a number of people out there that do not realise. They just think, I don't have a semi-automatic, so I'm not caught up in this. They are just learning now, some of them, about the magazine capacities and the different sizes of magazines for different types of actions. It's a real mess. And because we've had constant changes every single month, including this month, and they've been unnotified to the firearms community, how is the community meant to know exactly what it is they have to comply with? If there was an added 6-month extension, at least we could get that information out there.
Isn't that your job?
Is that our job?
Yes, it's the Council of Licensed
It's-
Firearms.
it's not our
job
law.
Well, I mean, should it be? The fact that
So we do disseminate through the organisations we're connected to and the individuals, but we didn't pass the law.
no, but you represent, you're the Council of Licensed Firearm Owners. Shouldn't it be within your mantra to inform your members about any changes?
Which we've done.
Which we have done.
Relying on the Herald.
And we have done that. We've got the message out far and wide to our membership. who of course are about 40 to 50,000 of the 250,000 out there. It is not our job to educate the other 200,000. We don't have all of their addresses. New Zealand Police do. Why have they not contacted everybody to make sure every single individual licensed firearm owners knows what they need to comply with?
To be fair, our understanding is when they sent a letter out to the 250,000, 50,000 of those letters came back again because they didn't have accurate addresses. But police even admitted in parliamentary questioning that this was going to be a 3-year program.
The survey, do you release the questions as well? So they
I'm not sure if they're in the release. I'd have to look at that. It's due to come out this afternoon. It'll be along the same lines as the survey we ran last year, which was around trust and confidence in service delivery.
We ran the survey for over a week and got over 5,000 responses to it.
You've said 50,000 is not a number to boast about, but is it a good start?
Well, it's a start when you're looking for compliance with the law. But when we give an estimate of 170,000, it's not a number to be boasting about. It is not successful. It's a failure. So if you have a failure, we need to look at how we can put that right, how we can put it right as a society together, working together, not dividing us. And currently, that's all this government's wanted to do, is put that wedge in between a sector of law-abiding community and the rest of the general public.
This is a bad outcome for us. As licensed firearm owners, we're looking at this and saying, in the future, these firearms, if they don't come forward, they end up feeding into the grey market and the black market, and licensed firearm owners will be blamed for these firearms being in circulation. Police will have to deal with these firearms at the front line. It's not a good outcome.
So you'd agree with the premise, the intention of keeping Kiwis safe, but not the way that the process has been played out?
We were always about keeping Kiwis safe, and we have a record that we can stand behind as far as shooting sports and target and hunting. Some of the significant changes done in the 1960s around educating firearm owners around firearm use and safety greatly improved the accident rate. The improvement in the security requirements in the mid-1990s, we saw a drastic decrease in the suicide rate with firearm and accidents with firearms. So absolutely, we're in support of keeping Kiwis safe.
And we've been a part of that for the last 26 years. Where we have been left out is in this latest legislation, and what we see now is a mountain of errors resulting from that.
Do you expect a second amnesty will be set up at some point?
There are there's an additional bill before Parliament. There's supplementary order papers. They're silent on whether there will be a buyback and amnesty. There has always been an amnesty open in the Arms Act. So at any time someone can take a firearm into police, that continues.
What is scary, though, is that we still have our Minister of Police, along with police themselves, saying they're going to come after people and put them in jail. So there's no encouragement for people to hand in through amnesty if they're being threatened publicly.
If you look at managing a population behaviour, 10% of the people will always obey the law, 10% of the people will not obey the law. 80% of the people will comply dependent on what's the chance of getting caught, what's the punishment if I do, and what's my motivations. And a lot of law is about making it easy to comply and difficult to not comply. This approach has absolutely undone that.
Alrighty, do we have any more questions? I think it's a pretty good